Our scripture this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 24 through 30, and then 36 through 43. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Well, do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Later, his disciples asked him to explain the parable. He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear." The reading of God's word. Oh, I thought that worship team did a great job. So you probably don't notice this, but we have a new refrigerator out there in the foyer, thanks to Dawn and Brian going out and getting that, and thanks to Benjamin for making it fit, because evidently we don't measure real well. But anyway, it's done, so thank you. That's the way the church works. People come together, and it happens. So today's sermon is about the wheat and the tares, if you're familiar with this from the King James Version, or wheat and weeds. And really what it's dealing with is what is the hope for the future, and what are the weeds for today? What's the hope for the future, and what are the weeds for today? So one of the things I read this week, an individual said, nothing may influence human actions more than the future. Humans act in the present based on their beliefs about the future. We act today because we expect the action to bring about a certain future. So you invest money because you expect a certain future to happen to your investment. You marry someone because you expect a certain thing to happen in regards to that relationship in the future. No one marries someone with the expectation in 3 months we're getting a divorce, right? No, you're expecting that you're going to spend the rest of your life together. You go to school because you believe that in the future your schooling opens up an opportunity for you. Jesus has a future for us. Can you believe that today? But before you get to the future, you got weeds. Now, I understand people who own townhouses or apartments, you're awesome folks because you don't have to weed. But I feel like all my life I've been pulling weeds. When we would go home on vacation to my mom's house, Claudette and I would pull the weeds between the bricks that were growing up on the front sidewalk. And then we'd go to the garden where she planted all these wonderful flowers. But, she sowed good seed, but somebody... Who the heck planted those weeds? That's what I want to know, right? And we had to pull those up and put newspaper down and throw mulch over them to try to keep them down. Even in our house right now, Claudette and I, this is the first time, we made a determination. We're getting the mulch out before hostas come up, and we'll just deaden these weeds. And we pulled some weeds that had grown up, and we put preen down. I hope you don't get mad at us for using chemical weed killer, The other day we're walking around the house and we're like, where did all these weeds come from? I thought we dealt with this back in May. They're there. They're there. As I walk the dog, after all this, so many things have grown. They've gotten bigger. But you know what's grown the most? Those obnoxious weeds. And by the way, if you look in a dictionary, the word obnoxious is used for the definition of weed. It's an obnoxious growth. And I think it's the best definition of a weed that I've ever seen. And here's the other thing about weeds. Now, those thorny things that grow up like along the sidewalk, I know that's a weed. But then Claudette and I, she's the gardener. I really don't like getting my hands dirty, but I have to go out and help her. So we'll be getting into the garden, and to weed, I'm always asking her, is this a weed? Is this a flower? Is this a weed? Is this a flower? So, you know, number one, weed pulling is mind-numbing and meticulous, but when you don't know which is the weed and which is the plant, it just gets bored. The other day, I was out there pulling weeds, and I'm like, honey, is this a weed? And I pulled it, and she's there, no, that's the plant. I just put it in there a few days ago. So, so God's telling me not to help in the garden. That's how I take that. Yes, it was. So Jesus tells a story here about what the kingdom is like by telling a story about wheat and weeds. Now, why does he do this? Why does he have to tell this story? Because the people he's talking to don't recognize him as the Messiah, the hoped-for, anointed person of God who's going to get Israel back to their greatness. Some do. The disciples kind of see him that way. But not everybody does. So their expectation of this Messiah is the Messiah is going to show up, Rome's going to fall, Israel's going to rise up again and be an independent nation, powerful with its own king, wonderful palace. Herod's temple, which many of the Jews really had struggles with, because here's this Roman emperor who built this temple that the Israelites worshipped in. Herod's temple would be replaced with a real righteous one. That's what they're hoping for. And then Jesus is walking around, he's healing people and, you know, giving them sight, taking away leprosy, helping them to walk if they're crippled. And he does these kind of miracles that show something about the kingdom of God that says, just so you know, here, you can see again. See, I have power over sight. Only God can do that. Oh, by the way, your complexion is now 100% better without using any of those chemicals. I just took away your leprosy. And you know why I can do that? Because I'm God. And God's reigning right now. So those were there, but he has to tell this story because people are just thinking about this cataclysmic, radical change that has to happen if the Messiah comes. And you know, I think today, honestly, I think we're the same way. I think we expect, you know what, I've preached it. I got to own it. What's my favorite verse? Wherever Christ is, there's a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come, right? So if I'm limping here, I got Christ, and I'm dancing over here, right? It doesn't work that way all the time. There are miracles that occur. But Jesus is saying the truth about the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdom of heaven is just another way of saying the reign of God, is that there's some things that won't change right away. And this is the future. This is the future. So what we have to understand is there's this misalignment between what people understand Jesus to be and the Messiah, but he sets them right with this little story. So he tells this this wonderful parable, which just takes a simple idea of everyday life, wheat and weeds, something that most of these people would have known about. And he introduces the idea of the kingdom of heaven. This is the first parable that approaches it this way. And he says, I'm just going to read it for a little bit and then talk about it, read it and talk about it, and then maybe I'll finish up. So he says, the kingdom of heaven is like, which means there's a similarity between the kingdom of heaven and this story I'm going to tell you. It's not like a man, it's the whole story. The kingdom of heaven is like this whole story. So don't get caught up in individual things. It's the whole story that he's trying to tell us. It's like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. So this was good seed that was sown. It was useful. That's another word for good. It was beneficial. It would have fed people. This is all good stuff. It was purposefully sown. It was sown for a reason and a purpose, but something happened. This man had an enemy. And this enemy shows up while everybody's sleeping, and he does something dastardly. I just wanted to work that word into the sermon today. He sowed weeds in that same field while everyone was sleeping. And these weeds were like the crop that would actually grow. Their germination time was similar to that of the wheat. And when the wheat sprouted, so did the weeds. And it became very difficult to separate the two out. From everything I've read, whatever this weed was, it looked so much like wheat, at least in its early stages, that you couldn't differentiate between the two. It was only as they matured that they would be able to be differentiated. But by then it would be too late because the root systems would be together and they're close together in the crop, and it just gets problematic. So then the story goes on. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Hey, sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" That's what I ask Claudette every year she plants a garden. I thought you just put flowers in here. Where did these weeds come from? "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" So I want to jump ahead here a little bit, but just understand that there is a gospel story that we talked about last week about the sower who goes out to sow, and it falls on 4 types of soil. And all but 3 of these soils, that seed, the word of the kingdom of heaven, goes away. It doesn't really connect and grow in the individual or the soil that it gets into. But that last soil, the 4th one, the seed sinks, it goes into roots, and it has fruit. We need to understand that there is an enemy out there who doesn't want you to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. There is an enemy out there that will produce really cool things that will distract you on your walk of faith. In fact, I believe that that enemy will create more cool things than visually evil things to distract us from serving God or believing in God. That enemy will use many things that God has created to draw us to God, and he will use them to distract us and pull us away from God. But just so you know, there's no level playing field in the world that we live in. There is a good sower, and there is an enemy who's sowing too. And maybe that's too simplistic for your mind, but the scriptures want us to understand this reality. Maybe it is more complicated than that, but just so you know, we're not. It's just not one message that's out there. There's many messages, but one of these messages is true, and one of these messages will change your life in positive ways. And that's the message that Jesus Christ has sown. So, should we pull him up? And his answer, I believe, surprises them. He says, no, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may pull up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into the barn. So the question of the parable is, what's to be done with this mixed field, weeds and wheat? How is this situation supposed to be dealt with? And the surprise move, or maybe it was expected, was to allow the two to grow together. Maybe that was an agricultural strategy of the day. I don't know. But I also know that from now on I will tell Claudette, let your weeds and flowers grow together, and we'll see what happens at the end of the growing season. Amen. What's going on here is that this weed is entangled with the roots of the wheat. It's hard to define and differentiate between the two. It was so close that its removal would threaten the purposeful, beneficial cash crop of wheat. But it wouldn't be like that forever. He knows this, that owner of the field, because there would come a harvest time, and at the harvest time, everything's going to be uprooted anyway. But the difference is once it's uprooted, they know the difference. And so the weeds would first be bundled together, then cast into a fire. And then the wheat would go where it was going to go, be placed into the barn for future use. So what did these unbelieving crowds get from Jesus' parable here? Well, that's a good question. I don't know for sure, but here's two guesses. These stories reveal what it is like now, right now, back then and even now, that God has begun to restore his royal rule through Jesus' ministry. There's something in this story that reveals not just to first century people, but to us 21st century believers, what it's like when God starts to restore his rule through Jesus Christ. The kingdom of heaven is like this story, and you and I are living in this story right now. It's not just a first century reality, it's a 21st century reality too. Second, at the present time, do not expect Jesus' ministry to be different than it had been. In other words, okay, Jesus has gone around, he's doing some good, people are changing their ways, there's been some healing that's going on, but don't look for anything else. It's not going to get more grandiose. Well, you could argue it did. The tomb was empty, he was resurrected from death, death was defeated. But really, when it comes down to it, this is pretty much what 21st century Christianity is like. It is the way it is. Sometimes we would like it to be more exciting. It's not. Not for lack of trying. Sometimes we would like to see more outcomes, but we don't. Sometimes it is just, quite honestly, can we say we get bored with it? I don't know if we should or not. But the gospel of Jesus Christ, like I said last week, is a seed. It's thrown. It doesn't come at you like a hammer. It germinates in the hearer's heart and does things quietly. And yet at the same time, it can do things forcefully and radically. Back in the day when I thought smoking was the biggest of evils, and I used to judge about whether someone was a good Christian by whether or not they smoked or not. I was before I understood addiction and a number of other things that get in the way of that. But I also understand I got my own non-smoking, smoking-like issues in my own life that are hard to put away. So what I know is that while we can make this kind of picture of what a Christian does do, which back in the day, so just so you know, you go to Wheaton College, you have to sign this form, and this is what a Christian looks like at Wheaton College. You don't dance, you don't smoke, you don't drink, and you don't go to movies. So if you don't do those, what was that, 4 things, 5 things? You're a Christian. That defines you as a Christian then. Don't smoke, don't drink, don't go to movies, and don't dance. I think that's still on their books. I signed it. Because I didn't do any, well, I did go to movies, but when I was at Wheaton, I couldn't afford to go to movies. But maybe you can't watch TV and look at the internet now, I don't know. But so we have this stereotype vision of what a Christian is, and what this is telling us, that there's a reality to the kingdom of heaven that it's dangerous to stereotype what a Christian looks like. Because what we know is the world and Christianity sometimes are so closely related that there is no way of telling them apart. Stop looking for something different from what I am offering you, Jesus says. I must seem totally strange, like a man who has an enemy who sows evil, scatters weeds in the field at night, and then the owner doesn't do anything about it because he doesn't want to harm his crop. So the disciples later on say, what were you talking about? Maybe that's what you're saying right now. So Jesus unfolds the story. He says the sower of the seed is the Son of Man. That's Jesus. He says that this Jesus sowed good seed, not bad seed, not mediocre seed, good seed. It's seed that has purpose. It's seed that serves the Lord. It's seed that mirrors Christ. It's seed that is part of the kingdom of heaven. He says the field that it is sown in is the church, right? No, he doesn't say that. He says it's the world. It's not the church, it's the world. The church is in the world, but he's saying he sows to the world. Like we saw last week, the sower was indiscriminate in where he threw that seed. Good soil, bad soil, he didn't care. It's going everywhere so that everybody has an opportunity. The good seed, he says here, stands for the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil. The enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age. The harvesters are angels. Now, we all love Jesus, right? The world loves Jesus. They either respect him for who he says he is, or he's a great teacher. But what the world doesn't love is the fact that the majority of his teaching has to deal with the end of the age and judgment. That there is something coming. The future is ahead of us. And what he's going to tell in this story is that it's important for us to know that future so that we can survive and live in our present. And this explanation changes the focus of the story that actually he had told to the crowds that were with him. When Jesus told it to the crowds, the kingdom requires patience and waiting. Things aren't going to change a whole lot, he said. But Jesus' explanation to the disciples focuses more on the end game. At the end of the age and the judgment, he says, as the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I particularly don't like that imagery. But what does it matter what I like? It's there. I got to deal with it. But what it does tell us that things will not stay the same. That there is something that's coming down the pike in the future. Maybe not our immediate future, but in our distant future. Who knows? I don't know where this happens. And it's hard to read the New Testament without getting this reality about history. It's going to end, whether we like it or not. But it's not like it's going to end and there's nothing after that. There's going to be a judgment. There is an end of the age. And that is when the world will be sifted. And that's when this thing that Jesus talks about, this new heaven and a new earth, where everything in creation will be set back the way it should be, almost as if Genesis 3 never happened. No more fall. No more weeds. No more heart attacks. No more cancer. No more racism. No more police brutality. No more criminals. No more. There's a new heaven and a new earth. Life will be lived like we just can't imagine. That's the future. That's the hope. I know some people believe the blessed hope is the rapture of believers, but the hope is, as we say, usually at communion, we talk about we're going to do this until he comes again. Because once he comes again, there's no need for us to eat bread and drink juice. Because everything will be set right. But what we fail to understand sometimes is even right now, Jesus is on the throne. Thank you. He is on the throne. The kingdom of heaven is in place right now. And we need to follow him. According to this story, it's very difficult to determine who is a weed and who is a wheat. Just look at your neighbors and figure out, is that a weed or is that a wheat? No, don't do that. I already know who you are. No, I don't. Lives are so intermingled and entangled, it's really hard for us to know. When we look at the outward flesh, then we become like the family of David. Remember when David's going to be king and the prophet goes to that family and they look at all the sons and there's some really big strapping ones. Oh, he's going to be the king, right? And God tells the prophet, the problem is you're looking at the outside of this person and not looking at the heart. How many of you can see the heart of the person next to you? John can. I can't. I could predict the heart, but I don't know for sure. So let's just look for a minute. To Sunday the 30th, Set Free Dubuque. There'll be maybe 100 people down there walking around a couple blocks, dressed in black, quietly, supporting Set Free Dubuque and the end of human trafficking. How many of them will be Christian? Who knows? How many of them will not be Christian? Who knows? The reality is there will be a mixed field down there. Some will be Christian and some won't. You don't have to be a Christian to be against human trafficking. Or, Black Lives Matter. How many of the people involved in Black Lives Matter are Christian? Who knows? Some are, some aren't. You don't have to be a Christian to care about the life of someone. How many people who stood outside Planned Parenthood were Christian? Who knows? You don't have to be a Christian to think abortion is wrong. You don't have to be a Christian to believe that a capital punishment is wrong. In fact, you will find Christians against capital punishment and for capital punishment. You will find non-believing people for capital punishment and against capital punishment. It's weedy, thorny, and weedy all at the same time. That's where we're at. But let's not think that Jesus is passive about evil here, though. He says later in 2 sections of Matthew, he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. He doesn't mean to actually gouge out your eye. You all know that, I hope. We had somebody in El Paso who had a brother who thought actually he tried to do that. That's not what Jesus means. Or how about Matthew 18? Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Such things must come. But woe to the man through whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Jesus is pretty serious about evil and sin. But you notice what he's serious about here. Do you notice he's not, I'm going to use Dawn for an example. I apologize. He's not saying to Tim Bees, Dawn, you need to pluck that eye out. It's not my job to be an eye plucker. It's not Dawn's job to come to me and say, Tim, a hand of yours has to go. What Jesus tells us to, because honestly, the only people we really know, and I would argue that that's questionable, is ourselves. And he says, check your own fruit. Check your own heart. Deal with the sin in your own life, and let me deal with the sin in other people's lives. And quite honestly, dealing with your own issues is a full-time job. Don't add on something that I've never asked you to do. So it's right to go out and do things for human trafficking. It's right to go out and do things to try to set the world apart. But what Jesus is trying to say here is, in the world, there is wheat and there are weeds. And that will come to an end at the end of the age. And he says, when this happens, then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Isn't that a cool picture? The righteous, those who follow Jesus, will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Shine like the sun. Finally, you're out in the open. Finally, the cape is off. Finally, the closet door is open. Finally, everything is, you can be 100% for the Father. Because all the weeds in your own life have been taken away, and your wheat can shine. But also, there's no one who's attacking you. There's no one who's holding you down. There's no fear involved anymore because the weeds are taken away. And I want to be very careful here that the actions of people are not what make them evil seed. I want to say that. What's clear in Scripture is, where's your heart? Who's it attached to? Are you worshiping the God who created you and gave you ability and loves you and guides you and helps you and protects you, whether you know him or not, in more ways than you can ever imagine? One writer I read this week said, ultimately the weeds would never let God be God. Ultimately the weeds only wanted God the way they wanted God to be, and they refused to acknowledge God as God is. And I don't know about you, but it is hurtful when people refuse to accept me for who I am. Don't you find that about yourself? When people look at you with expectations and they hold you accountable for these expectations, and it's not you, or they think you're something you're not. They give you strengths you don't have, or they give you weaknesses you don't have. We want to be accepted for who we are, and God's no different. That doesn't make him weaker. It just means that that's the way we were wired. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. The future, the fact that everything that is right will come to fruition, is what drives us and encourages us to be the Christians we need to be today. Because we know there will be a day, it's not now, there will be a day when the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father, and he will have total reign on his field that is the earth. This is the Christian hope. Amen? He who has ears, let him hear. Lord, as we close out this morning, we thank you for this word. It's a hard word, Lord. It's uncomfortable to talk about the end of the age and judgment. And yet you don't want to see anyone go through judgment. That's what your word tells us. You don't want to see anyone face an eternity away from you. And we know, Lord, that you sow the seed of the kingdom of heaven to everybody on this planet. And we all have a free choice of accepting it or rejecting it. And we know that there's an enemy that gets in the way and distracts us and works against us. But we know there's a more powerful God who will make sure that his word, his seed, will get a proper hearing by each and every one of us. And yet mysteriously, some of us will reject him. Reject you, Lord, and live our own way. Lord, I pray that we would come to you and live by your will. We pray that in Jesus' name.